Hey guys, Matt here with M2 Lumber. Today I'm going to show you how we built this white oak dining table, specifically the custom base with the mortise and tenon and through stretchers. First step we're going to do is mill down the lumber to its rough size. Once we have it cut to its rough shape, we're going to set our table saw up with our digital angle finder. Then we're going to go ahead and trim the first end of all of our legs and set the length for the legs using a tape measure and a marking knife and our marking gauges. Now we're going to be using our marking gauge and angle finding tools. This is really important if you want to get really high accurate cuts on a lot of your project builds. I highly recommend using marking gauges and marking knives instead of pencils if you're not doing that yet. It really does refine some of the accuracy levels. And when you're talking about joints that glue up and you don't want to have visible gaps between them, a 1/16 of an inch is what makes the difference. So this is really important to be able to do it in this manner if you're not. Again, with our slider, setting it up at all the complex angles that we have for this build, we can set our stops to make repeat cuts quick and easy. Now, all of this was designed and modeled before we sit down and start, just cutting pieces. We're going pretty quick here, but we did have a full 3D model and drawings that we're working off of, so we know exactly what our dimensions need to be for all of our cuts. Now here we're taking and we're drilling some holes to remove most of the waste material for through mortise on the legs for the A-frame. We're just going to drill that out with a Forstner bit, and then afterwards we'll go over to the bench and clean that up with a chisel. Now here I'm using my chisels. These are just Irwin marble chisels. They're pretty good chisels for what you pay for them. There are better ones out there, but these get the job done, so no complaints. I'm using a backer board to keep it vertical on the top plate of the mortise. That's the most important one for me, to make sure the stretcher sits level and there's not too much up and down slop. Side to side I'm not as concerned about, just because of the function of this stretcher. It needs to hold the legs in tension, so top and bottom is a little bit more critical than side to side. So once that's done, we're going to go and work on the top plate for the leg base. These are the holes we're drilling, which will essentially allow the top plate to bolt to the underside of the table. So they'll have through holes all the way. And now we're going to set up all of our loose mortise and tenon joinery to put these separate pieces together. I'm using the domino for this. It's just so much faster and easier. The accuracy level is very high. Could do this with hand-cut mortise and tenons on every single joint for the leg bases. But to be honest, it looks just as good, it's just as strong, and most people won't ever notice the difference between it. The biggest thing for us trying to produce lots of quality furniture is that you can't really beat the price. So this is what we do. It works out pretty good. Are there better ways to do it? Sure, probably. But this is what people are, for the most part, willing to pay for. And so that's what we do. Putting the whole thing together here. This is where it's really nice to have those angled clamp. I don't know what Bessie calls those. They're like basically inserts that go onto the parallel clamps, and they allow you to clamp angled surfaces, and they work really well. So if you don't have those or haven't seen them before, I definitely suggest you check those out. Now that we got our pieces all glued up, we're going to put it on the table, line it up exactly where it needs to be, and mark our holes. I'm setting these about, I think, 16 inches from the edge. That's plenty of room to give the person sitting on the end some leg room, so they don't have to worry about hitting their knees up against the end of the table. Now that we have those marked, we're going to go ahead and drill some holes for our threaded inserts. I like to use a pilot hole because that really helps to make things simple. You can set your pilot hole to a known depth, and that basically acts as a stop for your larger drill bit. And then once we get that done, we can put our threaded inserts in and bolt everything back together. Yeah, on and off and on and off. It's a very repetitive process, but it's very necessary if you're going to make sure everything comes together correctly. So now we've got it bolted and the legs set in place. Now that I know where those are going to be, I'm going to align my stretcher and essentially just mark it. I do have a drawing for this, but nothing ever comes together perfect when you're building something this large, so it's always best to just mark everything physically rather than go by what it should be according to a drawing. So that's what we did there. Then I'm going to transfer my single markings all the way around, because this is going to be a giant tenon on the end of this stretcher on both sides. So we just trace our line all the way around so I can see exactly where I need to cut it over on the table saw. Now I'm going to use my dial indicators to set the depth. The depth of the table saw blade here is going to mark the shoulder height of my tenon. So this does need to be very, very accurate. And I am actually going to leave it a little proud, so I have to clean it up with the chisels. You'll see in a little bit. There's many different ways that you can do this. You've probably seen this type of method before, just using the table saw blade to make a clearance cut with it. Because I have the slider, this seemed to be the most efficient and easiest way for me to do this. If I didn't have this, I'd probably use a router or something else, but this was pretty quick and pretty easy because I have this nice slider system for my saw stop table saw. And then you can see it supports way out on the end there, so it's pretty easy to do. Once that's done, we'll take it over to the workbench, and this is my favorite part, just knocking all that off with a hammer. But then we're going to clean all those little lower parts with the chisel there, being very careful not to gouge or dig too deep. This is what you would call, I guess, sort of like paring with your chisel, and just cleaning up that entire surface so it's nice and smooth. And then I always like to go ahead and just slightly chamfer the corners. It greatly reduces the chances of anything fracturing or breaking or splintering, which is pretty likely on oak because it likes to do that. So if we just go ahead and chamfer the corners there, it reduces the chances of that happening in the long run. And it does make assembly of this tenon and mortise system a little bit easier anyways. Okay, now that everything is cut, we're going to go ahead and pre-assemble. And what I'm doing now is basically just making sure everything fits, and I don't have to do any other kind of pairing or cleanup. Our holes still line up. And then once I get this all put together, now I have to mark the position for the holes that we're going to add more mortises for the pegs that will hold the stretcher in place. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm marking where it's flush on the surface, because the idea from this peg going through is that it puts pressure against the surface of the material that the tenon is coming through on that mortise, and it basically pulls it up close to that surface so that it's nice and tight. So we're going to go drill some holes using a Forstner bit. I'm putting a backer on there so we don't get a whole lot of tear out. And if you notice, I'm putting the drill just slightly on the other side of the line. That's not a mistake. That's on purpose, because what we want to do, again, is to pull the tenon through the mortise. If I put it right on the line, there would be no hole or area left behind it where it could pull through. It would just sit flush, which is best case. And over time, as things get loose and worn out, that won't be good enough anymore. So you put the hole slightly behind it, so as you drive that peg in, there's at least 1/8 of an inch clearance behind it, and it can really pull that tenon tight up against the mortise there, which is in the legs. Now I'm going to be making the pegs. I always like to rive these, so I'm just taking a little small block of wood and splitting it with a chisel. That gives me some really nice straight grain. And the only reason to do this is because it'll be very, very strong and I don't have to worry about it breaking. Now I'll take it over here to the edge sander and just get my final shapes and wedge them in there upside down. Here you can really see how it just pulls it together. And I'm going to flip that bad boy over all by myself, which I do not recommend, but when you're in a one-man shop, sometimes that's what you have to do. I do have some employees, but no one was here today, so. And now it's looking nice and solid. Love the way that it feels. We just got to do some sanding and spray some finish on it. We're using General Finishes Endurovar, one of my faves, and this is a Fuji Semi-Pro system. And then she is good to go. Again, this was reclaimed white oak provided by our customer. We kiln dried it and then turned it into a table for them. Thanks for watching, guys.